Okay. So we're going to do the standard purchase requisition workflow. Before I get started, um, of course, I have to tell everybody about it all the time. I have a website I've built, ljstraining.info. If you go there, there's a lot of different training material. I try to keep updated with new stuff each week. There's a lot of topics on Intacct. If you're a new user, there's stuff that's in that area just for new people. Purchasing, reporting, accounts receivable, closing a fiscal year, approvals, and program monitors. We have Martis, so if you need information on Martis, you can go there. There's information on Workforce Go. I'm starting to add some general computer things. I know like Excel and some stuff like that people struggle with. But that's a good place to visit. I also have a YouTube channel that I add all my videos to. So if you have time or you're not sure about something, more than likely you can find an answer for what you're looking for on that website. So today I'm going to do a general overview of the standard purchase requisition workflow. We'll go through building a purchase requisition, converting it to a purchase order, and converting it to a voucher. So this is the most common workflow, and this will allow us to touch base on, on attachments, budget, spend management, and a few other things, hopefully. So we'll go through purchase orders, vouchers, justifications, closing a purchase order, and then printing or emailing a purchase document. So in the overview, I have this table. The first column is the type of general ledger activity, or the activity basically that affects your financial reports. So the first one we have is the document that creates the commitment or encumbrance on our financial report. So with what we're discussing today, that's the standard purchase requisition. That only happens when the status of that document becomes pending, and those are the journal entries we see get made. So it's a little more behind the scenes of what we see, but if we're making a $100 purchase requisition, once the thing is fully approved, we know $100 is going to show up as an encumbrance on our expense account. In this workflow we're going through, there is no direct general ledger impact when it concerns a purchase order. Just having a purchase order doesn't mean anything else is going to happen. It's the purchase requisition that creates an encumbrance, and it's other documents that release an encumbrance. The purchase order is basically the go-between our initial request for approval and then the last thing we need to pay. The purchase order is also what gives us the formal document the tribe uses as the official purchase order to give our vendors. So when we see our purchase orders, we might see statuses of pending, partially converted, draft, or in progress. Regardless of what any of those things are, we know that with the purchase order existing, there is no effect on our general ledger. Now, the document that releases commitments and post expenses, those can be a voucher or a justification workflow. Those states have to say closed, meaning we've converted our purchase order into a voucher or a justification, and then they've been approved. And so once they've been completely approved by the two approvers of a voucher or a justification, the first step that happens is the encumbrance gets released. Then the next step that happens is the expense gets posted. And then finally, the document that releases a commitment but posts no expenses, and that's a closed partial purchase order. Just by submitting one, it goes automatically approved. There's no approval workflow. So once that's closed, it releases the encumbrance. So these are the steps in the workflow we're going through, what we can expect should happen with our finances as we're going through this stuff. These are the different purchasing states. So we have draft, which means if we're creating a request, we can save it as a draft so that we don't submit it. It doesn't become a formal document yet. If we need to come back and still modify what's in there, or we still have more questions about what it is, so we're going to draft it and let someone else look at it. In progress is related to a draft. It's a document that's been converted, but then the document it was converted to is saved as a draft. So if we converted a purchase order into a voucher, but saved our voucher as a draft, the purchase order will say it's in progress. Pending is a document waiting for action by a user. Partially converted means a blanket PO that's been converted, but not all of the quantity field has been used or exhausted. Converted is a document that's been converted to the next document. All of the quantity was utilized. Closed means the payment request was fully approved. Submitted, the first person in the workflow has the document. Declined means someone along the way has declined it and it's been returned to the program to edit and make any corrections to submit again. And then of course, partially approved. If there's multiple approvers in a workflow, that means one of those approvers has approved, but the others haven't yet. So when does a purchasing transaction impact the general ledger? When all approvers in the workflow have approved, never any time before. And this means that budget availability is not affected until after a document is approved. So be careful of multiple submissions you think might be within budget because Intacct is accepting them and letting them through. Check our reports, check them often. And basically what that's saying is if you had a $100 budget and we submitted a $90 request, until it's approved, the $90 has no effect on your general ledger. So you could continue to submit requests because your budget hasn't been impacted yet. And so if we had two $90 requests, both will be allowed to be submitted. But once one of those is approved, the next time someone tries to approve the second one, the approver will get an error saying that there's a problem with your budget and the record can't be created. So that's just something to keep in mind, that you can submit stuff all day long, but until it gets approved, there's no effect on the general ledger. It's usually the biggest problem we see is with travel related requests, but since the tribe really hasn't traveled at all the last year, we haven't run into that problem. But we'll see multiple travel requests coming in, and then the next question someone will have is, why did you approve so-and-so's but the rest are getting declined, thinking that that one person was picked ahead of everyone else, but it's typically for this reason. Same thing on encumbrances. They do not clear until after the payment request is approved. So if we submit a payment, we don't expect the encumbrance to go away until after the payment is approved. So if we're looking at budgetary things, we need to make sure we wait until we get approval first, and then we can move forward. And so after submitting our purchase requests, it's good to check your financial reports or check a purchasing report, and then check them again so that the thing you expected to happen, you can see actually did. Typically not a good thing to wait until the last day of like a reporting period, for like some people do with grants, and then wonder why did something happen that they didn't expect to. And so everyone's rushing on the last day to fix something. We can solve it by looking as we're doing these things. Our entire workflow is built around this resolution for procurement. I'm not really going to spend much time on this, but there's a bunch of different levels. So if we're using the purchase requisition workflow and we have a submission bigger than 800, we get that little warning that says, are you sure you're following the rules? And the rule for stuff over 800, purchase order required, telephone bid with documentation, and the awards have to be made to the responsible bidder, that kind of stuff. So it's just making sure that we have our ducks in a row before we go further. So the standard purchase rec workflow has 3 basic steps. The first one is the user has to create a purchase requisition. And the purchase requisition, of course, is our request for approval through the tribe to obligate money. we want to create a purchase order. It starts with this purchase requisition. Once we've submitted, the second step is the program approver, whoever's been assigned to approve your request. They're the first person that gets their chance to say yes or no. Regardless of the decision they make, there's no effect on the general ledger, meaning no effect on our budget, no effect on their finances. So if they decline, the document goes back to step 1. If they approve, goes to step 3, which is the program monitor. They have the same decision making as the program approver. Approve or decline, that's their step. If they decline, it goes back to step 1 to start over. If they approve, finally, our encumbrance is now made, our debit is made to an expense account, and the offset entry is made to our encumbrance control account. The user would get an email saying your request has been approved, and you'd be ready to take the next steps. And at this point, now our budget's impacted. It's been reduced. The availability's been reduced by whatever our request is. So this is that same flow, just in table format, and all the ways where the budget is impacted. And the only time is on approval, the complete approval of the request, not at any other stage of a purchase requisition. Once we get approval, the next step is to convert it to a purchase order. Purchase order can then become a voucher, justification, or a closed partial PO if we ended up not using it. And some final information before we start getting into Intacct. Approvers cannot edit a document. So if you've submitted a request and you realize that you forgot to add someone as an authorized purchaser, or we forgot to include something in a memo field, that kind of thing, down the line, no one can add that stuff for you. So it would have to be declined and the process started over again. This is important because we have to utilize certain fields, and failure to use them correctly can cause delays. Vendor document numbers on payment requests have to be unique to each vendor. If we use the same one that we've used before, the final approver will get an error, and we'll have to decline it and send it back. We now are currently using a class dimension on about 89 of our roughly 200 expense accounts. Budget gets verified when a user submits a purchasing transaction. So just make sure before you get started, does the line item for your funding source have the funds available to accommodate your request? On submission, budget's not affected. Budgets are affected when it's fully approved. And it's important to understand this because you can submit multiple requests that meet an existing budget, but in totality may exceed your available balance. That's a big line of confusion, so I felt worth repeating that a bunch of times. All right, any questions before I get into the standard purchase requisitions? Feel free to use the chat box to type out your questions, and I'll answer them as we're moving on. So as we're in Intacct, we can open our drop-down menu, and the purchasing application has access to all the different purchasing areas we might see. Under quote is where we find purchase requisition. Under order is where our purchase order and our closed partial POs would be. And under invoice is where we find the voucher. So we might have to visit 3 different areas depending on the type of document we're looking for. We're going to start with creating a purchase requisition. I'm just hitting the plus sign. And we start with the date, which seems simple, but it does cause problems. If we notice the date is highlighted, that means our cursor's in the date field. And if we're not careful at this stage, we can already set our document off the wrong way. And so the reason I say that is Intacct has shortcut keys. And one of those keys, for example, is the letter R. If I type the letter R, the date is going to get changed to the last day of this calendar year. And so we can see that's just changed to 12/31/21. And what tends to happen is, I think most of our vendors start with the letter R. We hit that R and then we see that the vendor field didn't key up. So now we move on to vendor and start looking for whoever it is that we're going to do business with. Not realizing we've changed the date to the end of the calendar year. So we just want to be real careful. There's a handful of keys in the presentation that I was going through. I do have that as a chart. And so you can download that at the website, and I'll email it to everyone after this. But there's a handful of keys that can change that date. So just be really careful about that. Keep an eye on what we're doing on the top. So the R does the end of the year, and a T does today. So we're back to today's date. And that's the first obstacle for us, is that date. And on a standard purchase requisition, whatever date we use, that's the date the encumbrance will post to. So I have today's date. And if I submit this document and it doesn't get approved until Thursday, it doesn't matter that it was approved on Thursday. This thing was dated for January 12th. That's when that's going to take place. So we have our date. Now we can enter a vendor. Simply, just by typing letters from left to right, Intacct will start matching what we're typing to find the vendor. If we were looking for somebody that we knew had the word building in their name, I start typing building, we bring up one vendor. That might not be the person we're looking for. Intacct only reads left to right. So we might feel like we're at a conundrum here. Or should we request for a new vendor if we can't find them? We can take it a step further just in case. We will all have a view and find option. And if I click on find, it brings up a box. It will have this stuff. And if I start with a percentage sign, it makes it a wildcard. So instead of reading left to right, Intacct's now going to search for the word build at any point in the vendor's name. And so now I have an option for 4 vendors instead of 1. So just something to keep an eye out for, especially on people's names. For the most part, I think they try to do the names, last name, comma, first name. But like when the surnames start getting put, the senior, junior, some of the names can get a little wonky if we're looking for that. So this would be a nice way to find someone rather than having to make a request and possibly duplicating vendors out there. And if I take out that percentage sign and just use build, we're back to that first result of just building sprinkler, because that's the word the vendor starts with, build. But the vendor I want to use is called testing vendor. Once we select a vendor, this stuff fills in automatically for whatever information is tied to the vendor, their address. Then in the next area, this is called the header area. We have payment terms and expiration date. Utterly meaningless in the purchasing transactions, but it's a field that's required to have a date. Everything basically defaults to 60 days and then gives us a date 60 days from now. Has no bearing on anything we do, so changing the date doesn't do anything, it just has to be there. Our purchase requisition, we have this vendor document number. At this point, it's not a required field for you to use. You can share whatever information you would like here. It'd be mostly for internal information. Same with the message field. The shipping field is not something we typically use, so you don't have to worry about using this. We have authorized purchaser. So if whoever is going to be authorized to actually go to the business with the purchase order to pick up whatever product we're buying, whether it's to Turtle Creek or Menards or wherever you're going, this is where we can type the name of whoever's going, so that the official document, when we get this approved, will include who that person is. And then we have the attachment field. There's two ways to add attachments. I'm gonna minimize the screen a little bit here. First, the most easiest way to add an attachment is to find wherever it is on your desktop and then to drag and drop it. And we can do that with multiple things. So we could keep dragging and dropping attachments and they'll keep adding to this as we go. I like that because you see that little bar that fills up really quickly, tells you that it's been attached. And then up top up here, we can also see the confirmation that the attachment has fully attached to the document. So then we know we can move forward. So that's one way we can do the attachments. The other way is to click the drop-down box and click Add. And now we have our attachment box. You can give the name of the folder, whatever name you would like to use. Most of us have a default folder. Mine's Finance, so you can use Finance. But to attach, we would do it just like we would in email. We click Browse, find wherever the attachments may be.
Has left the meeting.
Oh, there it is. And then we can select multiple stuff to attach and then attach them. And then make sure our progress bar is 100% and then we can click Save. So those are the two ways we can add attachments. So once we have the two documents attached, there we go. And I'm gonna open up this attachment. What I want us to notice is easy for me to have done this preparing for this, but how I named the attachments. And so we have a quote. I used the vendor name test, what it was, and the date the quote was generated. And I also have one with the vendor name and the EPLS that we have to attach with our request. It makes the document much easier to read for whoever's approving your stuff. So just something to keep in mind, and probably a lot easier for you to find in your desktop too. A lot of us that use scanners, the scanner will automatically name it some long series of numbers. That makes sense to the scanner, just a serial number, and then the next time you scan, the next number gets taken, which is fine. But at some point down the road, everyone has to read your attachments. If there's like four attachments with those kinds of numbers, it makes it hard for the approver to figure out which attachment is what. So please give a name to your stuff. All right, so now we have our header information filled out. We're ready to move on to the line entries. Where are we requesting to spend the money from? So for those of you who have access to multiple programs, which in here we have 2 employees that can, first we want to know which program we're using. I do get emails from time to time with someone asking me, why can't I use this funding source or find this funding source? And many times it's because they have access to more than one program and they're using one program and not the other. So we have a question, does the EPLS date have to match the same date of the request? It should. So I'm going to go to sam.gov, which is where we can get the EPLSs. And we have an area to search records. Typically, of course, it should be current to the day we're doing the transaction. If we had one that's a week old, in theory, these guys are constantly updating their database of who can and can't do business with government-funded entities. And if we used an old EPLS, we run the possibility of doing business with someone the government doesn't allow the money to be used with. So yes, please keep it current. And so if I go to the search bar, we can look up my vendor, testing vendor. Click search, we get the result. No records found. Perfect, that's what we want, right? There was a record found, we have to go look for a new vendor. So at that point now we can save our PDF of whoever it is. And at the bottom it has the date and time the thing was ran. So anyway, that's your EPLS from sam.gov. And if you use a Chrome-based computer, when you go to print, you actually have an option to print to PDF. Yep, there's two different ones. There's this and OIG. So we have the EPLS. Now what program we're going to use? Fortunately, I created a test program, so that's what we're using. Creating a test funding source. So that's the one I want to use. And here's the account numbers I can choose from. Class is currently required from us, so I might just use the class regular. Office supplies, so who knows, it might be, everyone is asking for ink lately. We've been getting those messages saying, does someone have ink, whatever. So we might have something like that there. Maybe we're buying one and it's 25 bucks. So at this point, we'd be ready to submit. If you want to know what the potential impact on your budget is before you move on any further, there's a nice little nondescript button right here that says Show Spend Insight. And if we click that, we're going to get told what our current budget is, what's actually been posted to it, any open POs, and the result of this purchase, how much funds will be available when we're done. So it's a nice little look quickly at what we want to, what we're trying to do. And more importantly, if I hit submit and for whatever reason this didn't meet the budget, I don't know if probably most of us have gotten this message at this point that it exceeds the budget, contact your budget manager or administrator, whatever the error says. The first thing we should do is actually go to Spend Insight and see what our budget actually looks like. And then we can get a pretty quick answer on potentially what our problem is. If we had open purchase orders that we needed to close, we would see an amount here. Or if we spent more money than we planned on spending, okay, great, I should do a budget mod. Nice, easy information for us to find. But before I submit this, I want to look at a report. Under General Ledger, and it's going to be the Dimension Balance Report. On Thursday, I'm going through this report on how to do it, so I might go through a little more quickly on this one. But I'm going to use the entire life of this funding source. I want to look at the encumbrances also. What was that account number? 69050. So we're just going to keep it to this one funding source. So I've got our program, our checkbook, our funding source in here. And I have it going to display a funding source ID and a vendor ID. This report can be built to show a lot of different dimensions: customers, funding sources, checkbook, program, counts, all that good stuff. I'm just going to leave it at funding source and vendor for now. But what I'm doing here is I'm asking Intacct that for the life of this funding source, I want you to look at the encumbrances and the other book we use, the accrual book, and tell me, is there any activity with this account number for this stuff? Nothing. And we've seen that when I hit Show Spend Insight. There was nothing, no actual spending, no encumbrances. So now I'm going to go ahead and submit this. So we can see the document here. Let me filter out everything else. It's in a submitted status, right? So the first person that has to approve, if they have their option turned on in their user profile, she just got an email saying LJ Moran has submitted a request, number whatever, waiting for her approval. But if we come back to this report, I'm going to reload it by clicking view. Nothing has changed, right? It hasn't been approved, so our finances aren't affected yet. So something nice to keep in mind right here. So at this point, we're going to be waiting for people to approve. If we go into this document, we view it. When we go to the history tab, there's an approval history. We can see the number of approvers who will be approving this document at some point. So we can see the first person, Christine Korigel, it's been submitted to her. So once she takes action, then it goes to the next person, value approval. That's a term just meaning program monitor. Then they'll have an opportunity to approve. All right, do we have any questions about this up to this point? Okay. So off screen, I'm getting the document approved. So I'm gonna go ahead and refresh the screen. Status has now changed to pending. The thing has been approved. So if I come back to our financial report here and I refresh it, now we see the effect of the request being approved is that $25 encumbrance. And we also know now that the thing I expected to happen, my $25 request for this vendor, has actually happened. So now we're fine, we can move on to our next steps. So as we're back in the standard purchase requisition area, I've refreshed the screen, our status has changed, and we have an extra option for us to do, which is convert this document. And depending on the type of view you're using, convert might be on the left side or it could be on the right side. So under the default all view, it's on the left. If I change this to a different view, which is a customized view, my request is now on the right side, or my action I can take. So just look to the left or right. And the option I get is purchase order. If I printed this document, the purchase requisition isn't the formal thing authorized by the tribe to be used with our local businesses. So it's not set up to have anything formal. There's no signature. The authorized purchasers doesn't show up on it, that kind of stuff. And of course, that's not even called a PO. It's a purchase requisition. So this document isn't going to do us any good to go to Turtle Creek or wherever we might share this with. And that's the step the program has responsibility for, which is to convert it to a purchase order. When we're at the stage of converting this document to a purchase order, this document is left open, meaning you can edit information. My pleading to anyone who is doing this is to never change anything at this juncture. There is no reason for us to make a change. The document we had approved is the one that we were requesting approval for, and it should be in the format we want it in. So if we change anything here, it may affect the encumbrance from being able to release later. So when we're in the process of converting, we hit that convert, click purchase order. The very next step should just be to click post. Nothing else. Now that I've posted this, we have a purchase order that's been created. In my user preferences, I have it set so I don't leave the workflow I'm in after I post a document. There's an option you can have there if you want to go with the document or stay. I like to stay because if I'm doing something in purchasing, that usually means I'm fixing a bunch of stuff. I don't want to have to keep bouncing back and forth between screens. So this allows me to keep working on other purchase requisitions. So I'm gonna have to go to purchase order. So we'll go back to purchasing to order, purchase order. And here is that PO that's waiting for me to take action with. So if now I'm ready to submit this to testing vendor, I have a couple of things I could do. I can come here, check on the print box, click OK, and then print a physical copy of this. And how we can tell this is the official document is, first of all, it's colorized, and then there's the treasurer's signature, and then his digital authorization that this is the formal document. Here's my authorized purchaser. John Doe is going to get to spend $25 at our testing vendor. So you could print this, or you could print it to PDF if you want to save it and then email it to someone else. Whatever is easiest for you to do. You can also choose to email it to the vendor. So if I select email, I can type in the email of whoever that is. So if you know who the contact is, put that in there. And the only thing I'd ask is, if you do this to email, my name and my email address is going to pop up. So make sure you change that information to yours so that when they get the email, it'll say it's from you and not from me. Occasionally someone will send these POs to people, and then I'll start getting emails with questions about whatever it is someone's trying to buy. So it just causes a little delay in getting those answers now, because then I have to go find out where it's from and connect those parties together. So just make sure you change that. It'll always have to be changed anytime you email. So Intacct doesn't remember that it's you. It'll just go to me as the default contact for Intacct. But now we have our purchase order. We get our invoice, we're ready to pay. We'll have three options for converting. We can close it if we're not going to use it. Use a justification if my request had exceeded 10% of $25. So my request is $28. I need to submit a justification with authorization from the treasurer's office that here's why I've exceeded the amount that was approved for me. Or if everything's within norm, I just need to make a payment, we can use a voucher. So first thing I want to look at is the close partial PO. If we're closing a purchase order because we're no longer using it, the date's going to default to today's date. So if our fiscal year has ended, we're going to have to be mindful of that, because the first thing we'll have to do is change the date to match our fiscal year. So keep an eye on that date. If there's nothing else for us to do, all we have to do at this point is post this, and that full amount will close, and then the encumbrance will be released. And on this step for closing a PO, there is no approval workflow. No one else is going to see this. So that responsibility is going to be on you as the user to make sure it's done properly. So if you do that, my advice would be, when you're done, to pop over to a report like this and run the report to see, is that $25 encumbrance still sitting there or not? A first indicator of whether or not we've done everything the right way. But we're not going to close this. We're going to submit this as a voucher. So I'm going to convert this into a voucher. And just like the purchase requisition, we have some dates going here. The date, the first just date is the transaction date. Whatever you have here, if I change this date to tomorrow, the GL posting date changes to tomorrow. If I change it to the 9th or the 8th, GL posting date changes to the 8th. And that might be fine for whatever you have going on. But if the general ledger posting date needs to be different than the date we're processing, you can either change this first one, which changes that, or you'd have to manually change this date. And whatever date is reflected in GL posting date, when this document gets approved, that's the day that the encumbrance will clear and the expense will post to. So just be real cognizant of that. And probably the majority of all cases, we're just using the current time frame, and that's fine. But something to be cognizant of, especially at the end of our fiscal years. Some of us have fiscal years different than the tribes, so just something to keep an eye on. So once we have our dates situated, the expiration date stuff still stays there. Has nothing to do with purchasing, but it's a field I can't get rid of, so we'll deal with it. But then we have vendor document number. This becomes a required field that we have to use. If you have an invoice and you know the invoice number, please use that. If you have an account number, some sort of designation that's going to make this unique. So I might say test January 21 invoice. Well, I'm only doing business with them once this month. I know that's not going to be repeated again. Or if we had an account number, I might put the account number at the end. Account 123, or whatever it might be. So we're certainly making this a pretty unique number. If you had invoices, we might just have the invoice number. It's going to have to be unique to however you're using this, so just make sure you don't repeat them. The message field, it's still something here you could put. You're going to pick up the check because you're going to take care of mailing it or whatever. You can share that there. Our attachments are still here. So it's that original attachment from the purchase requisition. So we have a couple of things that we can do because now we need to add an invoice. Easiest way to add an invoice is to drop and drag, right? So here's my invoice. Done. I don't have to mess with editing that folder or doing anything else like that. That attachment's now there. So if I open up the folder to view the attachments, here's my invoice, here's my EPLS, and there's the quote. So I feel pretty good about where I stand now on being able to submit this for a payment. At the end of the year, we'd have to let the finance people know, is this for the current fiscal year or was it for the previous one? So it's a current one for this request. This information, there'd be no reason for us to change it. If we do, it's going to cause an accounting problem. So we want to pretend this entire stuff doesn't exist until we get to price. So if our price had changed, now the ink was $22.99 instead of $25, I'll change that 25 to $22.99 because that's what we actually want to pay. We want to match what the invoice says, right? So we have that. And now we have our vendor document number. I've added my invoice. I've designated the fiscal year period that this is for. And I've updated the price to match the invoice. I can now submit. So here is my request. It says converted because I've converted the purchase order to the voucher. My preference is I stay in the purchase order screen. So we would know as a user, if I'm looking at my list of purchase orders, great, I've converted this to something else. I know it's either been paid or I've closed it. If I'm not sure yet what I've done with that, I could view the purchase order, go to the history tab, and down here is a history of the documents telling us, here's that purchase order, this is what it was, this is what I converted it into. So if I'm researching the POs to find out what I did with them, now I know which voucher I can look up. So now let's go to the voucher workflow. Let's filter out all the other stuff so we can just have just the one thing I'm working on here. Here's the voucher for testing vendor. Here's my total. I'm using a custom view created by October 7th, 2016. So it's a view I created 4.5 years ago. This also tells us if it's been paid or not. Total paid is nothing, so we know that this hasn't been submitted. A check hasn't been produced yet. So the payment status is open. But at this point now we know the state is closed, meaning it's gone through the 2 approvals I needed it to go through for the voucher. So if I come back here and refresh the screen, that $25 has changed to $22.99. Because now we've had a $22.99 expense post. And if I were to update this to take away the expense book, so I'm going to uncheck this but still leave encumbrances there, I no longer have an encumbrance because that voucher has been approved. And the approval of the voucher releases the encumbrance and posts an expense. So if I update this report now to get rid of the encumbrances and just use my expenses, there's my $22.99. Okay. So that's all the stuff I'm covering today. The reporting stuff I'm doing on Thursday, so if anyone's scheduled for then, I'd see you then. Does anyone have any questions about this workflow, states or encumbrances, that kind of stuff? Okay. All right, well, thank you everyone for your time today. Have a good rest of your day, and if I see you on Thursday, I'll see you then. Goodbye.